Well, good morning and happy Father's Day to all the dads in the room. And as Taylor read for us this morning, our passage there in 1 Peter, that's where we're going to be this morning, starting in verse 13. And we're going to kind of be looking through that as we wrap up our series on expectations with what God expects from all of us. And what does that mean for us? What are we supposed to do about that? What's kind of, the picture with that? Now, we could go to all kinds of places to talk about this. But this is one place in particular where we're going to talk about God's expectations for us. And in this passage in 1 Peter, we're going to see that there are these 4 commands that Peter gives us. But don't worry, you're not going to have to listen to me give you 4 points. We're not going to hit, well, point 1 is and point 2. Don't worry, we're not going to do that. But these 4 commands all actually point us to one point, to like one thing that God really expects from us. So we're going to kind of work our way through these and see what it is that kind of the big picture, the bigger idea that Peter has in mind for us in this passage this morning. So if you look back at chapter 1, starting with verse 13, I just want to draw your attention there to those first few verses again, where Peter writes, "Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, 'Be holy, because I am holy.'" And as we've hit some of these passages in 1 Peter, one of the things we've noticed is he uses quite a few metaphors along the way to help us capture a spiritual reality. And he starts off right away in verse 13 with 2 really important metaphors if we're going to understand what God expects from us. And that first metaphor he gives, he says there, with minds that are alert. And that's not really the best translation of that phrase. That's not quite the best way to put it. It literally, if you were to literally say that, you would write the phrase, which of course we all use every day. I know you probably just used this morning as you got up and got ready for church. It's the phrase, "gird your loins." And I know you all use that all the time, right? I do, you do. Gird your loins. Or, maybe a better way to say that would just be ready for action. Be ready for action. We might say, we might use it a little differently. Like it might be like, we might say something like, tie up your running shoes, lace up your running shoes, get ready to go. We might say something like that. It might be kind of that moment where we say, all right, playtime's over. Time to get serious here, something like that. If you're into sailing and, care about pirates, you might say like, batten down the hatches, there's a storm coming in or something like that. It's that sense of something's happening and we need to get ready for it, right? It's that moment when if you're playing a video game, you're just kind of kicked back, you're just relaxing, and then that 10-year-old gets online and is just destroying you, and you're like, what is, and then you have to lean forward, you have to get more serious. It's go time. It's put on your game face. That's kind of what Peter's talking about. And that phrase goes all the way back to Exodus chapter 12, where God told Israel to prepare to leave Egypt for the promised land. That's where that phrase first came, that idea that Peter's drawing on. So Peter's just reiterating, hey, just like God said, it's time to get ready. It's time to be aware for what's happening. Get ready to move. That's what Peter's saying. You've got to have this attitude of lean in, get ready to move, be aware of what's happening around you. And then he hits us with this second metaphor right away, where he talks about being fully sober, which is a little more obvious, right? He's just using the metaphor of, don't be drunk. Don't be like, a drunk person who stumbles around, isn't totally aware of what's going on, doesn't have a good grip of their senses, and probably, says things they shouldn't say, does things they wouldn't normally do, gets themselves into trouble. Same thing. Peter's saying you've got to be spiritually aware. You've got to be ready to move and go wherever it is God's directing you. You've got to be prepared. And so that's kind of his attitude to set up this passage for us is, hey, be ready. He's saying the Christian life is not a lazy boy recliner kind of life. It's an athlete. It's be ready to run, be ready to move, be ready to act. And so he sets all that up. So that's kind of the attitude. Have all that ready to go. And then he gives us our first command right after that, where he says, set your hope. He starts off with set your hope. And we probably, use the idea of hope a lot of times. We talk about what we hope for, what we're hoping in. We just kind of throw that word around. Hope sort of combines these three different things, all wrapped up in hope. So hope is an expectation that something will happen, it's trust that it will happen, and it's patience while you wait for it to happen. So when you set your hope, you're expecting something, you're trusting in something, and you're patient for that thing to happen. So Peter says, well, set your hope on the return of Jesus. Trust that it's going to happen. Be patient while you wait. Expect that it's going to happen. That's kind of how he explains setting your hope. That's kind of what gets wrapped up in hope. So maybe you've heard of this news story. You have to think back a little bit, all the way back to 2017, which I think it would feel a little closer if it wasn't for COVID, but it feels like that was forever ago. And maybe you just saw this like a blurb on the news. It was something called the Fire Festival, spelled F-Y-R-E, because that's cool now. You change the vowels, and it's cool. So there's this thing that they were going to do back in 2017 called the Fire Festival. And a guy named Billy McFarland, who was a young man who was determined to get crazy rich super fast and retire by age 30 or something like that. That was his plan. And a rapper named Ja Rule. I know, you're like, this sounds like a winning combination right here. They got together and said, we're going to launch a luxury music festival to promote our new app that lets you book high-class, artists and things. That's what their plan was. So they promised 2 weeks in the Bahamas on this private island, just you, and it was going to be this huge music festival for 2 weeks, and some of the best food, luxury resort, it was going to be awesome. So people were signing up because they saw this all over Instagram, these beautiful pictures of the ocean and these boats and everything. And, one of the pictures is there's these artist sketches of what these, kind of villas you could live in look like, and they looked really nice. They had these views of the beach and everything. They look great. But here's what happened. So they bought their tickets. They headed to this private island. They get there. They get on the bus from this because it's a small island. So they get off in that little airport. They get on buses. The buses pull up to where the destination's supposed to be, and they don't see luxury resorts. They see these FEMA tents instead. And they're all like, what? Excuse me? What did we just all pay for? And there are not these nice giant mattresses, but stacks of these air mattresses just scattered along the beach. And there's not even enough tents for everybody or enough air mattresses for everybody. And there's no electricity or lighting, so everybody's running around trying to figure out what to do before it gets dark. And there was absolutely zero coordination. It wasn't like you had a FEMA tent with your name on it. It was just, here's these tents, here's these stacks of air mattresses. Good luck, I guess. And it was crazy. So now here's this picture of the food that everybody was promised. And it looks great. That looks good for lunch. This is first service, so maybe you're not quite hungry yet. But that looks pretty good. Well, they get there. There's no 5-star chefs. There's no luxury anything. Instead, they're all served a cheese sandwich in a little plastic container. And I mean, just a couple slices of cheese. That's what they got. That's all the food they had. So it pretty much went downhill really, 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 really quickly. Not the luxury resort, none of the food. All the bands weren't even there. There was no music festival. All the bands either never agreed to come or canceled, at the last minute. And nothing was there that was promised. It was awful. It was pretty terrible. So, if you were to jump on the internet and do some research, people will say, the internet will say that some people paid, thousands and thousands of dollars for tickets. They really didn't. Most people spent anywhere from $500 to about $1,000 to go. So for most people, what they saw from the marketing and the promotional material was this would be a great trip, a great getaway, 2 weeks of music in the Bahamas. Sounds like an awesome vacation. And then they got totally the wool got pulled over their eyes and nothing was there like it was supposed to be. They got a nightmare instead of a vacation. And now, if you were to take marketing classes, they use the Fire Festival as an example of what not to do. Because they talk about how these people, how they promoted it, how they got all these people convinced to come before there was any festival. None of the bands agreed. It was just a whole scam. And the guys who planned it got in all kinds of trouble. Right? There's documentaries you can watch if you want to know a little more. But it was a whole mess. But here's the thing. All right, think about it for a minute. These people put their hope for just a little bit in the fire festival. They expected they were going to have this great 2-week getaway. They put their trust in it. They trusted, well, these bands are going to be here, this food's going to be here, the resort's going to be there. So they paid money. If they knew that was going to be their location, you wouldn't have paid money for that. So they expected something to happen. They trusted it was going to happen. And then they patiently waited for the day to come and get their plane tickets and fly down there. And they put their hope in the fire. And it might be easy to look at the fire festival and go, okay, bunch of Instagram influencers got ripped off. They should have known better. Live and learn, all of that. But we all have our fire festivals. We all do. We all have our things that we put our hope in, and then we don't get what we thought we were supposed to get. And you probably, I don't think anyone in here went to Fire Festival, otherwise you probably would have, that would have been a crazy story to come home to. But we've all had that feeling, right? Imagine those people on the bus, and they turn around that corner, and they don't see this huge luxury resort. They see FEMA tents and just a random beach, and there's no food, and there's nothing. And you've all had that sinking feeling. It's that sinking feeling. It could be as simple as you go to a restaurant, you order this meal, you're expecting it's going to be really good, and it's not at all like the commercial or the picture looked like, and it's not all that good, and it's not that much food like you were expecting. Or you go to the doctor's office, and you have to hear, it's cancer, and you get that feeling. You've all had that feeling. Or it's the feeling of, hey, the money's not there anymore. Like it's that feeling of something you didn't think was going to happen, happened. It's that feeling of, we're going to have to let you go. And we've all had that sinking feeling. And a lot of times that sinking feeling comes from bad news, but sometimes it comes because we've put our hope somewhere that it doesn't belong. It just doesn't belong. We've put an expectation in something, we've put trust in something, we've been patient for something, and then it didn't pan out. And there's all kinds of places we put our hope in. And what Peter is saying is, don't set your hope in those places. Because that's another way of talking about idols. You put your hope in something that isn't God, and then that thing can become an idol. And all idols do is they set you up to knock you down, and they promise what they'll never deliver. They can convince you for just a little bit, just long enough, but then they'll get you, just like the fire festival. They will get you. And you'll have that sinking feeling, and you just won't know what to do. What do I do next? And one of the areas that I've seen people kind of all across America put their hope in a way that's actually really, to me, very worrying is politics. That's one of the areas I've seen it the most. So, and here's what I think is ironic. We make jokes about how politicians, they're always going to let you down. And it's like every 4 years we forget all that. And we get all fired up about the next election. And it's like, you remember 4 years ago we all joked that like they weren't going to do what they promised, right? Like we have that joke. But we forget about it every single time. And I mean, here's what I'm going to say. If the last election made you really, really angry or really, really upset, and it didn't just take you like overnight or a day or two just to, because I get it. Politics, are they important? Yes, they're important. They matter. There are things that we have to address politically. But if you couldn't just the next day or a couple days later be like, okay, it's fine, God's still in control, moving forward. If you still were upset, you probably put your hope in the wrong place. And on the other side of that, if you threw like a huge party and were celebrating because of the last election and the results, your hope's probably in the wrong place. Peter's saying, don't put your hope in that. The Bible calls places like the Oval Office God's footstool, which means they're not that important. God's not really worried about what goes on in the Oval Office or in other political places around the world. He's not worried about any of that stuff. And Peter's point is, you've got to be real careful where you put your hope in. And for this early church, like we've been saying, Peter's writing to a church that's like, what do we do when the world is so against us? And Peter's like, well, don't put your hope where they put their hope. That's going to get you all kinds of turned around. So don't worry about that kind of stuff. You got to put your hope in Jesus. And there's all kinds of places where our hope gets put in the wrong sorts of places. But we set our hope, it's like you put a stake in the ground, you say, we're not moving from this place. We're going to stick here. So setting our hope is part of what God expects from us, but it's not all of it. Because right after that, he says, be holy, because God is holy. Don't live like you used to live. Live like this new life that you've been given. And I'm sure you can all think back to a time when you were younger and you did something that you really regret doing. And it's like, that was silly, that was dumb of me. If I would have known better, if I would have had more information, if I would have been more mature, I would have never, ever done that thing. We all have that story like, and that's Peter's point. He's like, exactly. Like, so don't live like that old way. Don't live in that kind of way. Live in this new way that Jesus has given to you. Don't act out of that old way of life, right? You've probably all had that moment when you've realized like you picked up some things from your family and then somebody pointed out to you that that's kind of weird what you do, you know? Like maybe you got married and your spouse was like, wait, you fold your towels how? Or you do what? And you're like, I thought everyone did it that way. Like, no, everyone doesn't do it that way. Maybe it was your college roommate who was like, that's kind of, you know that thing you do, that's kind of weird. And you're like, wait, what? Because we all pick up stuff from our family and we think it's normal and it's fine. And sometimes we just find out there's a different way to do things. Or maybe we find out, oh, that's not maybe a great habit that I've gotten into. And we just have to change. And holiness is part of that process of changing, of not living in the old way, but living in a new way, in a set-apart kind of way, which is part of why we got to put our hope in God and not in other things, because we're supposed to live differently from everything else around us. And so Peter starts off with those two commands. He puts them together in a way. Set your hope, be holy, because God is holy. Reflect him to the world, because the church is supposed to be a little different than everything else on the earth. It's supposed to be just a little bit of a different kind of place. And it's different because we reflect the image of God to everybody around us. So then Peter moves on there in verse 17, and he says, since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believed in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him. And so your faith and hope are in God. So that third command Peter gives is live in fear, which seems like an odd command, because we all can probably think of other Bible passages that say, don't live in fear. Like, well, hold up. What do we do? Do we live in fear? Do we not live in fear? But Peter's point is, you do live in fear of one thing. You live in fear of God. But not a fear sort of like a relationship with an abusive father who you never know when he's going to just be angry and blow up at you or mistreat you or abandon you. That's not the kind of fear Peter's talking about. He's talking about the kind of fear because you know what God can do. You know of his power. And you really know he's going to do what he says he's going to do. Like, he's serious, right? I mean, think about your own father, your parents for a minute. There were probably a few moments where you were afraid of your parents because you broke some rule. You knew, I'm not supposed to do that. I did it. I broke the rule. I'm gonna get in trouble. And so maybe you knew when Dad hears about this, he's going to raise his voice at me. He's going to ground me. He's going to, whatever it is, he's going to make me do a lot of extra work around the house, whatever it was. And you were afraid, not because you were terrified of your dad, but because you knew he can actually make that happen. Like, if he grounds you, you will be grounded. Have any of you ever had the moment where mom said, just wait till your father gets home and he hears about this? And you're like, oh no, don't tell dad. Please don't tell dad. That's kind of the idea. It's God's serious. He's going to do what he said he's going to do. And so Peter says, if you're going to live in fear of anything, you live in fear of God. Not anything else in the world, but God. Because he's the one person who can carry out everything he said he's going to do. And so, on one level, it might sound like we're afraid of him, but really, here's I think a little bit of a deeper part of why we're afraid. We're afraid because, if you got in trouble and your dad laid down the law, it's actually because your dad's actually a threat to your laziness or your irresponsibility or the fact that you backtalk your mom or whatever it was. God's the same way to us. Because God is holy, he's actually a threat to our sin. So all the ways that we kind of like to live, but we know we shouldn't, God's actually a threat to that. He's a threat to our pride and our selfishness and us doing what we want to do. And so on the surface, it seems like we're afraid of him. Really, we're afraid he's going to change us. And sometimes we don't like to change, but Peter's like, if you're going to be afraid of anything, be afraid of God. He's going to help you be holy. So let him do that. And then Peter moves on to talk about being purified, and he says there in verse 22, he gives us our fourth command, which is love one another deeply. Deeply. And here's the great thing about love from God, is it's love without any strings attached. He gives 100% of his love without getting anything in return. And Christianity is about the only place that can offer that kind of love. Because so many other places, there is a little, even if there's a little something attached. Like, well, I'll love you if, or I'm going to be kind to you, or I'm going to treat you this way, but I'm expecting you'll do something down the road for me, right? And even some of us, we maybe, if we're honest, we've done that. Like, well, I'll treat you a certain way, or I'll do this, but I'm really hoping down the road it'll come back, or you'll do something kind for me. And Peter says, Christianity is the only place where you get this kind of love. And I think, big picture, something that Peter's reflecting on, big picture, is one of the earliest requests that God made of us. One of the earliest expectations, which was, will you let me be your God? Can you just let me be your God? That's what he asked for. And if you go all the way back to Genesis, Adam and Eve, that was all God wanted. Just let me be your God. Let me be the one in charge. And they didn't want to do that. They decided to do things their own way. So they sinned. They chose to eat from the only tree in the whole garden that God said not to eat from. And ever since that time, the image that's repeated over and over and over again is the image of, like, dads, you may know this well, when you would walk in the door after work and your kids, like when they're little, they just run up to you and they're so excited. Like, Dad, let's go play catch. Or Dad, can you come see what I did? Or let me tell you about what I did at school. But you've had that moment where you probably walk in the door and the kids don't come running. They're scared because they got in trouble during the day, or they don't want to show you the report card or whatever, or they got on mom's nerves and they know mom's going to go talk to you and you're going to lay down the law or whatever. And the image, ever since Genesis, instead of, because it used to be, before the fall, God would come down every evening to walk in the garden with Adam and Eve, and they would come up and they would talk about their day. And then for that first time, God comes down in the evening and he has to call out, Adam, Eve, where are you? Where are you? And they don't come running to him. They hide. And you've probably had that moment. You come home from work and you're like, kids, where are you? And they're hiding. They don't want to tell you what happened. They don't want to tell you what you did. And the whole story of Scripture has been that image on repeat. God comes to us, he calls to us, and he's like, where are you? And you're off hiding because you don't want him to know what you've done. You're scared. You're not sure you want to talk to him. But Peter says, no, you should set your hope on him. When he comes in the door, you run to him, you tell him what's going on. That's where you put your hope. You let him help you become holy. You let him show you his love. He's going to give you 100% of his love without any strings attached. And that's the reoccurring story of Scripture. Because Peter's saying, look, you haven't been bought with something cheap. You haven't been redeemed with cheap stuff like silver and gold. Because in heaven, God uses gold to pave the streets. Like, that's what concrete is in heaven. It's gold. He says, you've been bought with something far more precious. You've been bought with the blood of Christ. And so because of that, live a different kind of life. So Peter's whole point is, it's like, hey, fearing God, that's part of it, but that's not all of it. Loving one another, that's part of it, but that's not all of it. Setting your hope, part, but not all. Instead, Peter's big picture, the thing that he's all these commands point to is he's saying this. God expects that your salvation makes a real difference in your life. That it's going to actually change the way you think and change the way you live. Because that's what Peter's trying to tell this church. He's like, hey, you're worried because you're not sure how to react to the world. Well, don't live like them. Live a different kind of life. And actually, the rest of 1 Peter is about that. Live differently, even though it's not easy, and even though you get a lot of pushback. And there's actually 2 national holidays this weekend that helps us kind of apply and understand this passage. So let's start with yesterday, June 19th. So that was Juneteenth, and for the first time in the history of America, yesterday was a national holiday. And if you don't know what Juneteenth is, it celebrates June 19th, 1865, which is when federal soldiers got to Texas, to Galveston, Texas, took control of the state, and announced to that state that the Emancipation Proclamation had happened and the Civil War was over and slaves were supposed to be set free. And that was all news to them. They had not heard that yet. They didn't know that yet. It had been 2.5 years since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Civil War had been over for a few months. But it took time for that news to actually, and the authority to actually arrive in Texas. So that's what Juneteenth is a celebration of. It's a celebration of the actual end of slavery in the United States. But could you imagine if the soldiers show up there in Texas, they read the Declaration, they tell everybody, hey, that's the law now, the Civil War's over, slaves get to go free. Could you imagine if all the slaves at the time said, hey, no thanks, we're good. We kind of like it the way it is. We don't mind. We don't mind this at all. You're probably like, your living conditions aren't that great. You're not being treated very well. Like, are you sure? No, yeah, we're good. Just thanks, but no thanks. We appreciate the war and all, but we want to keep doing what we're doing. And I think in a way that's kind of what Peter's saying. He's like, Jesus bought you from your old way of life to a whole new way of life. Why would you live in the old way? You're getting like the raw end of the deal with that. Like you're saying, hey, thanks for setting me free, Jesus, but I'll stick over here. I'm happy with being disappointed by my idols all the time. I'm happy with being terrified of all these other things that God's really in control of. I want to live my life that way. Thanks, but no thanks. And Peter's like, you're crazy. So Peter's saying, don't do that. Don't do that. Change your life would be totally different. And now let's talk about today, which is Father's Day. So there's actually this institute called the National Fatherhood Initiative, and they took the latest census data just from 2020 and found statistics of what happens to kids who don't have their biological father in the home. And here's what they found. Kids without a biological father are 4 times more likely to live in poverty, more likely to commit a crime, twice more likely to drop out of high school, more likely to face abuse and neglect, they have double the risk of infant mortality, and 7 times more likely to get pregnant as a teenager, all because their biological father isn't present in their home and probably not very present in their life. So really all their research says that dads, you just have to be present. Like if you're just present, you make a significant difference in the life of your kids. You don't have to be perfect. The research says you have to be perfect, Dad. You have to always get it right. It just says no. Just be present. Just be there for your kids, and it'll make a huge difference to them. And that shouldn't be really surprising, because that's what God has taught us. That's what God has exampled for us throughout the whole Bible. Every story is just God is present, and he teaches us something from the fact that he is present. He always does. He teaches us something because he's present. And in 2015, Pew Research did a result that said that back in 1965, the average father would say they spent about 2.5 hours a week with their kids, but today that's up to around 7 hours a week. 7 hours a week. So they would say that's a positive thing. Focus on the Family says that's a good thing. That makes a huge difference. So dads, on this Father's Day, I want to encourage you. For those of you who you're showing up, you've been present in your kids' life while they were growing up, or even as maybe they're married and they live elsewhere, and you're finding ways just to be present. That's great. Just keep doing that. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get it right every time. Just be present, because that's exactly what God does for us. Of course, our Heavenly Father is perfect, but he's always present, and he teaches us something about himself through his presence. And dads, that's exactly what you're doing for your kids. They're learning from you because you're present and you're around, and they're picking up the life lessons you leave to them. And that makes a huge impact. So dads, thank you for doing that, and just keep doing it. And for the future fathers, hey, just whenever you have kids, just be present, all right? You'll figure things out as you go. You'll make mistakes. That's okay. Just be present. Just show up for your kids. That'll make a huge, huge difference, because that's what our Heavenly Father does for us. So as we wrap up here, as we close, and we're going to continue in our time of worship, I just want all of you to know that our Heavenly Father is a God who's always present. And what Peter's reflecting on is God's always going to be there. He's never going to fade. Everything else will fade like the grass. It'll wither, it'll fall. But God will always be here. He's always present. And it's that presence, that relationship that we're able to have with him, that helps us keep going, that helps us to be holy. And that's his expectation for all of us. His expectation is, let your relationship with him, let that salvation, let that good news of the gospel change who you are. So during this next psalm, if you want to talk more about Jesus, if you have questions, if you'd like to know a little bit more about that relationship, I'll be sitting up front, and I'd be happy for you to come down, and I'd love to talk with you and answer any questions you have. Or if you need some prayer, it's been a tough week, you need some encouragement, I'd be happy to pray for you down here, so feel free during this next song to come over, or just after service, come find me. Be happy to talk with you. Let's pray.